So, unlike Locke, Mill has a sort of more complicated theory of meaning. He does think that the notion of standing for something is a crucial part of the meaning of things. So he thinks all of these words stand for various things. But he thinks that some words also do more. So in his language, the idea of standing for, this is what he calls denotation. But as you'll have seen, he also has this idea of connotation. And the idea with connotation is something like, and it is a little bit difficult to figure out exactly what he has in mind in the chapter. But it seems to be something like, well, the connotation is a way of sort of pinning down what the word is standing for. So for instance, he talks about the example of human, and he says, well, the connotation of that is like, our sort of general shape, our general kind of intelligence, our speech ability, all the kinds of properties that distinguish us. And he says something like, well, imagine that we found this race of other creatures in Africa or something like that are very intelligent but have the appearance of elephants. He says, well, we wouldn't call those humans because they don't satisfy all the things in the connotation of human. So it seems to be that the way he's thinking about it, the connotation is sort of a way of picking out the thing that it stands for. So we can kind of draw a picture of how this works. So for a word like human, first of all, it has its connotation. And that's a list of, well, he calls them attributes, but we call them properties now. So he doesn't really say a lot about what's in the connotation, but it might be something like, has arms and legs, maybe opposable thumbs, intelligent, speaks languages. So these are kind of things that would be in the connotation. And then the connotation together, sort of picks out a kind. As we said, this is a kind term. And it picks out the kind of humans. Or the type of entity, a human. So as we can see on this picture, meaning is more complicated. It's not just this sort of direct standing for words like human, it goes via connotation. So I'll say this connotation, and this bit here is denotation. So there are ultimately, for a word like human, two ingredients to the meaning. And he thinks this is the same for what we're calling adjectives and what we're also calling descriptions. So for example, take the word gold. That was our example of an adjective. What's in its connotation? Well, it's stuff like, yellowish, metal, and so on. That's its connotation, and then it picks out, the property. Well, here's like a gold bar. Picks out the property of gold. And descriptions are similar, except rather than standing for like properties or kinds, they stand for individual people. So, remember our example was the author of Harry Potter. The connotation is just this bit. It's just the property in the description. So I won't write that out again. And then the author is J.K. Rowling. So with descriptions, just as with kind terms and adjectives, they have a connotation. It's easy to know what the connotation is in this case because it's just this part, and their denotation is whatever person they're used to talk about. So this is how the things that we're no longer calling names work. But what about names themselves? Well, here Mill says something interesting, which is that he thinks that actually, unlike everything else, names do not have connotations. So let's just draw a picture, for example, of the... So For instance, we'll keep our description, the author of Harry Potter. What about the name J.K. Rowling? For Mill, there's no connotation here. There's only denotation. In fact, actually, I'll just draw the arrow to the same person. So there's no middle step. There's no middle step of the connotation. There's only denotation. In other words, we don't, he thinks, use some sort of list of properties to identify who the word stands for. So this distinction, although it's kind of vague in Mill between connotation and denotation, is going to be a super important one. It's going to come up in one way or another again and again for the next few weeks. It's going to come up when we talk about Frege, it's going to come up when we talk about Russell, and it's going to come up when we talk about Kripke. And the question is going to be, what, if any, role does connotation play in a language? Different authors are going to call it different things, but the question we're going to be asking, and it's worth keeping this in mind because we're going to get we're going to be reading these texts in a lot of detail and paying a lot of attention to the finer questions. But really the big picture question is whether Mill is right that there are these two things, connotation and denotation, and which kinds of things have them. It's kind of interesting that while Mill is one of the earlier people to talk about this, he thinks there's a kind of difference between these two things. So before we finish up, let's sort of dig into why does he think there's a difference between names and descriptions or adjectives or kind terms. So there's two things Mill says about this, about why he thinks names are different from descriptions or kinds or attributes. So one thing he says is that, first of all, he says, as you saw in the section that you read, he says that, well, if you think about the reasons why people are given names, it doesn't look like, those reasons need to continue to hold in order for the name to be a good one. So he gives this famous example of the name Dartmouth. This is a place, well, I mean, obviously it's used for the name of various places in the US as well, but originally it was a name for a place in the UK, a town which is at the mouth of the River Dart. So you might have thought that, well, isn't Dartmouth just a counterexample? Isn't it just an example of a name that has connotation, namely the city at the mouth of the River Dart? But the thing that Mill observes is that, well, even if the river sort of changed course and that the town so that the town no longer lay at the mouth of the river, we wouldn't stop calling the city Dartmouth. We would continue just using that word to pick out the city. So there, even though initially it looked very clear what the connotation should be, it seems also pretty clear that we would continue using the name even if the city failed to satisfy the connotation. So his basic idea is, well, if you try to think about what the connotation is, it seems like you can just come up with examples where you would keep using the word to talk about the same thing, even though the connotation no longer applied anymore. But of course, the connotation, if it was there, would be the thing that was, fixing the denotation in the first place. So if words had connotations, it just wouldn't make sense to say that their referent could stay the same, or the denotation stayed the same while the connotation no longer applied. That just doesn't make sense on Mill's picture of how these two things hang together. There's also one further thing he says, which is actually unfortunately cut out of the excerpt you read in your text, but I'll just read it to you now because it's more of an explanation of how words are supposed to work in the absence of connotation. So what he says is that you should sort of think about names as acting like tags. So he draws an analogy between using a name to talk about something and marking something with a piece of chalk. So he says, we make a mark with chalk on a house to enable us to know it again. The mark has a purpose, but it does not properly have any meaning. The chalk does not declare anything about the house. It does not mean this is such a person's house, or this is a house which contains booty. He means treasure here, or goods. The object of the mark is merely distinction. So here's drawing an analogy. He says, well, Like, think about drawing a mark on a house. The mark doesn't necessarily have a particular connotation. It's just something that's there to help you recognize and pick out a certain object. And he thinks that this is just how names work. Names just work like marks. They're just ways to sort of pick out objects in the same way that we might mark something with a piece of chalk. So 2 things I'd like you to do here is I want you to think a bit more about that analogy with the chalk. Do you think the analogy between names and chalk is good? Do you think, is there a sense in which names really do work like marking the chalk? Or are they different? I also want you to consult your own intuitions about the Dartmouth case, because the argument there is a little bit quick. You know, he gives one example of a possible connotation for the word Dartmouth, but he doesn't really think about other examples. So something that might be good for you guys to do is think, well, are there other versions of this idea that names have connotation that might do better? But I want to wrap up by making sort of a big picture point about a distinction between what Locke is doing and what Mill is doing. I'm kind of just repeating something I said a moment ago, but it's super important, so it does bear repeating. Because one thing we've seen today is that there's kind of a competition between 2 theories of meaning. We had a sort of Lockean picture where we have words, we have objects or ideas, and we have this sort of standing for relation. And the kind of really important idea here is that all there is to meaning is just this sort of standing for relation. That's all there is to meaning. Words just stand for objects. Once you understand what a word stands for, then you understand everything there is to its meaning. And Mill, in a way, is rejecting that picture, at least for certain kinds of things. Mill is offering us a picture where sometimes there's more going on. So, for Mill, there are words. First of all, you have their connotation. These are properties. And the properties tell us what the denotation are. And denotation is just exactly the same thing as this idea of standing for. So clearly, on Mill's picture, things can be more complicated. There's more to meaning than just this standing for relation. This connotation bit is really important as well. Now, as we saw, Mill doesn't think this applies to all words, but he thinks that there are at least 2 different kinds of properties that are involved in meaning, connotation and denotation. Now, obviously, as we said, for names, what we're calling names, they only have denotation. But in terms of when we're thinking about meaning more generally, and we're asking the question, what is meaning? Mill would say, well, importantly, you have to keep in mind both of these 2 things if you want to get a whole picture of how language works. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start with Locke and Mill today it's not purely historical, it's not just because this is where the field started, but because there's basically going to be a competition between these 2 pictures of meaning. So, as I said, we're going to be getting into the fine details about semantic questions about names. But if you're asking yourself, and you may well find yourself, when we get into the details, asking yourself, like, why is this important? Why do people care so much about these things? The reason why these things are so important is because they're sort of, they're battle sites for the competition between these 2 bigger pictures of how meaning works. And the way we're going to try to resolve the competition between these 2 different kinds of theories is by looking more closely at particular expressions. And in particular, we're going to be looking very closely at names. Because we're going to be seeing, is the Millian view of names defensible? Can you get away with just saying names have denotation? Or do you have to say they have something like connotation as well? And something very historically interesting happened here, which is that, so Mill gave this view sometime in the 19th century. From the late 19th century up until the middle of the 20th century, the Millian view of names, remember the Millian view of names in particular, doesn't have connotation, was really out of fashion. In fact, the view that everybody had was more or less that Mill's only mistake was to think that this theory didn't apply to everything. We'll see lots of different authors saying that basically this picture is a model of how all of language works, including names. And we're going to see different versions of that picture over the next few weeks in both Frege and Russell. But more recently, starting with Kripke in the 60s and 70s, things have gone very much in the opposite direction, and philosophers have drifted back towards something like the Lockean picture. Now, they've thrown out the idea that they stand for ideas, but they tend to think that Locke was actually right, that the only ingredient in meaning is really this standing for relation, and that there's nothing more going on.